It was a big day for big pronouncements, a lot of promises, and even a little hope for global unity in attacking the world's big economic problems. Even the fractious French played nice. Now the 20 nations have to deliver on their pledges instead of all going home and going their separate ways. But if the world leaders assembled here are to be believed, the summit was a victory in the efforts to stave off a global economic depression. British Prime Minister Gordon Brown hailed an unprecedented level of cooperation between the world's biggest economic powers. And President Obama called the summit a turning point as world leaders try to turn the corner from recession to recovery. The conclusion of today's summit marked the end of the first leg of President Obama's big 8-day trip to Europe, and it's his first appearance on the international stage as America's president. It's also his first opportunity to field questions from a global audience. Obama spoke to reporters from across the world for almost an hour today. He likened the global economy to a sick patient, saying he thinks the G20 leaders have succeeded in prescribing the right medicine to stabilize this patient. He acknowledged America's role in creating the crisis in the first place, and he spoke directly to the American people about what these achievements in London will mean for Americans watching back home.
Look, I'm the President of the United States. I'm not the President of China. I'm not the President of Japan. I'm not the President of the other participants here. And so I have a direct responsibility to my constituents to make their lives better. That's why they put me in there. If I'm effective as America's president right now, part of that effectiveness involves providing Americans insight into how their self-interest is tied up with yours. And that's an ongoing project because it's not always obvious. This kind of coordination really is historic. I said in the meeting that if you had imagined 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago that you'd have the leaders of Germany, France, China, Russia, Brazil, South Africa, a president of the United States named Obama, former adversaries, in some cases former mortal enemies, negotiating this swiftly on behalf of fixing the global economy, you would have said that's crazy. And yet it was happening, and it happened with relatively few hiccups. I would like to think that with my election and the early decisions that we've made, that you're starting to see some restoration of America's standing in the world. Although, as you know, I always mistrust polls, international polls seem to indicate that you're seeing people more hopeful about America's leadership. America is a critical actor and leader on the world stage, and that we shouldn't be embarrassed about that, but that we exercise our leadership best when we are listening, when we recognize that the world is a complicated place and that we are going to have to act in partnership with other countries, when we lead by example, when we show some element of humility and recognize that we may not always have the best answer.
So what did President Obama and his fellow world leaders actually manage to accomplish here in London? A pledge of an additional $1.1 trillion in financing to the International Monetary Fund and other global institutions like the World Bank, a commitment to crack down on global tax havens and hedge funds, and the creation of a supervisory body that will sound the alarm in the future when it sees problems emerging in the global financial system, although some already suspect it really won't have teeth. Even early critics of the summit, like French President Nicolas Sarkozy, though, who threatened to walk out if he wasn't satisfied with the outcome, said today's results were beyond his expectations. But aside from the united front put forward by all of the world leaders, as the summit ended today, what was actually accomplished? And did President Obama achieve what he came here for? Joining me now is William Cohn, the former defense secretary under President Clinton. He is now chairman of the Cohn Group, which has clients that do business in Afghanistan. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And
great to be with you, Andrea.
You have attended you've attended a number of these summits across the world. You've been to NATO meetings. You've been to these kinds of meetings. How do you assess President Obama's first performance on the international stage?
I think you have to say it's been an unqualified success in terms of how he has presented himself, the way in which he has carried the burdens of the office, knowing that this is a much different world than perhaps we've seen since World War II. But I think that looking at it from this side of the ocean, he looked like he carried out that responsibility very well. He has a difficult job. The United States is playing in a bigger field now. As he was pointing out, it's a much larger group of people and nations that are represented. It's not the G7 or G8, but the G20. Getting 20 nations together to have a conversation and a dialogue about how we go forward with the financial crisis that we're facing globally, and also the situation in Afghanistan. I think it was a major triumph for him on his first venture abroad.
Well, there's an extra burden, though, as well, isn't there? Because, first of all, there's resentment around the world. A lot of people blame America, say that we started it, even though, you know, they bought into it, they bought those subprimes, their banks as well. But many people here in Europe blame America. So he was humble. He said he came to listen, not to lecture. And there was such a dramatic contrast with his predecessor and the perception, at least here on this side of the ocean, that George W. Bush dictated and tried to order people around. Was that the big thing, being humble and not trying to say that America has all the answers?
Well, he used the word humility, some humility, and also a willingness to listen. I think the word listen rings very loudly in Europe and elsewhere. I was recently in the Gulf area when he gave the speech on El Arabiya. And when he said that we were going to listen to other countries, that word itself, listen, resonated very loudly there, and people were quite enthusiastic about the interview that he gave. So I think it's a change. On the one hand, many have come to expect that the United States has been acting unilaterally, and what President Obama has said is we're going to engage on a multilateral basis. I think they very much welcome that.
Now, one of the things that struck me in having seen some of these economic summits before is that he also, at the same time, for the first time, met his Russian counterpart, Medvedev, and had his first meeting as well with the Chinese. And there are a lot of economic and other strategic issues with the Chinese right now. So he was juggling a lot of balls. Was that taking too much on, or was that inevitable, given that he was meeting these people for the first time?
Well, that's why they have the G20, and he was, I'm sure, well prepared for it. I just returned from China. I spent 8 days in China meeting with most of the leadership throughout the country. And obviously, they're in a much stronger position today than ever before. And they hold some $1.7 trillion of our debt. They have about $2 trillion in foreign reserves, so they're in a much stronger economic position, and they come there carrying considerable weight. And many other countries are looking to them in the future in terms of being a major global player. So he has got to take that into account, along with Russia as a resurgent Russia, given the size of that country and the fact they have a country of vast resources. And Russia, China, and others will continue to play a big role in the international arena.
Let me quickly ask you about North Korea, because there's an expectation that North Korea could launch a missile, a long-range missile, as early as tomorrow. There's not much that the U.S. can do. They say that they'll have a stern response, but they're talking about the United Nations, and Pyongyang doesn't seem to be listening very much to the United Nations these days. What do you think is up? What do you think North Korea is doing? Is this a succession issue? Is this a failing and enfeebled dictator trying to get attention, jumping up and down?
Well, North Korea doesn't have much to offer the world in terms of being a role model for anything that's positive. They have missile technology they're developing. They have a nuclear weapons capability, and they are really tossing that around to say, look at me. They want attention. They want to try to gain some concessions from the United States and others. So I think it's really an issue of them trying to draw attention to themselves at a time when the G20 are meeting, and to say that we're here and we're still something of a player. I think the United Nations, if it's going to be taken seriously, has to start enforcing its Security Council resolutions. And this launch would be in violation of the Security Council resolutions, and it calls for some consequence. And if the United Nations is going to have any kind of reputation, they've got to start enforcing the resolutions they pass. Otherwise, they'll be ignored, and frankly, should be ignored if there's no consequence to what they pass.
All right, we have to leave it there, but thank you so much, former Defense Secretary William Cohn. Good to see you. Thank you for your time tonight.
Good to see you, Andrea.